Hello, everybody. Welcome to the session on culture in education. My name is Magdalena Sztencel. I'm from the University of Gdańsk in Poland, and I'm going to chair the session today as well as give the first talk. And joining me today is Dr. Anna Godzik from Adam Mickiewicz University in Poznań. Unfortunately, the second speaker who was scheduled for this session, that is Nana Raihana Askurni, couldn't be here with us today. So we have made a little bit of a change to the schedule, which means that Dr. Anna Godzik's talk is going to come up as second. So she's going to start her presentation at 4:30. So I suppose we can start with the first presentation. Let me just share my presentation with you. Today I'm going to talk about intercultural pragmatics in the global English context, and I will begin the talk by overviewing the use of English as a lingua franca and its place in the global English framework, before moving on to the pragmatics of intercultural communication. So English as a lingua franca, also known as ELF, is the, I apologize, something's happening with my slides. They keep switching too early. So it's the most common use of English today, and it refers to any use of English among speakers of different first languages, for whom English is their communicative medium of choice. And it often involves communication between users from diverse linguistic and cultural backgrounds who need to understand a range of lingua-cultural norms in order to achieve communicative success. And as pointed out by some, English as a lingua franca is not a variety of English. Rather, it should be seen as a communicative activity, which is characterized by a variety of lingua-cultural contexts and a dynamic community of users. And in relation to English language teaching, ELF should not be seen as being in competition with the teaching of standardized varieties of English, such as British English or American English, but a functional extension of it, one that basically enables learners to engage with English as it is used in real life. Now, the complex nature of contexts and functions of English in the globalized world has led to the development of the Global Englishes framework, which incorporates research in the fields of English as a lingua franca, or ELF, and also World Englishes, which focuses on national varieties of English, such as British English or Sri Lankan English, as well as hybrid language practices. The overarching goal of the Global Englishes framework is to prepare users of English for communication in multilingual and multicultural contexts, or in other words, to foster intercultural communicative competence. And in order to achieve this goal, several areas have been identified as essential to making English language teaching more reflective of how English is used today. And among them are raising awareness of global Englishes in English language teaching, or ELT, emphasizing respect for diverse culture and identity in ELT, and also raising awareness of ELF strategies in English curricula. But before we delve any deeper into discussing some strategies for managing ELF contexts, let me look at the foundational concept of intercultural communication. So Skolin and Skolin distinguish three types of approaches to intercultural communication. The cross-cultural approach presupposes the existence of distinct, often nation-based cultural groups, such as the British, the American, the Polish, the German, and it involves comparative studies of patterns in communicative practices of such groups. The intercultural approach is similar in that it tends to begin with the assumption of cultural differences between different nationalities or other ethnic groups, but it focuses on how members of such groups negotiate their differences in interaction. And the third position, namely the interdiscourse approach, assumes that in any communicative situation, participants are multiply positioned within a complex system of identities such as gender, age, professional, institutional, religious, etc. And these identities, I apologize, my slide has jumped again. And these identities involve different ideologies, and they may be relevant or irrelevant in a given communicative situation. So the focus of the interdiscourse approach is the study of the dynamic and situated construction of cultural and other identities in discourse. Now, as pointed out by Piller, these different conceptualizations of intercultural communication are not merely theoretical. They have real-life implications. So following Nakane, Piller discusses the case of Japanese overseas students in Australia, whose silence in class was interpreted as part of the Japanese cultural identity. But when interviewed, it turned out that most of the Japanese students wanted to participate actively in class, but were uncomfortable about speaking up because they lacked confidence in English or simply weren't sure about what was expected in class. And I think that what is important to note about this example is that whereas the classification of silence as a national cultural trait invites a passive acceptance of such behavior on the part of the teacher, the understanding of its real causes is likely to prompt the teacher and maybe co-learners to find a solution. And in the field of ELT, the cross-cultural approach appears predominant. As discussed by Alptekin, even though integrating language and culture has long been assumed as pedagogically valuable, ELT materials tend to present an idealized image of the English-speaking culture. And as a result, learners are instructed to use and interpret language in reference to monolithic, often nation-based assumptions about cultural norms, rather than in relation to specific communicative situations. And looking at the issue from the teacher training perspective, Dogan-Siak-Tuna argues that preparing teachers and learners for intercultural ELT should involve demonstrating areas in which discourse systems may vary, as well as raising awareness of individual variation and the dynamic nature of communication. And similarly, Baker argues that the concept of intercultural competence needs to involve the so-called expanded competencies. And again, crucial to this notion is an understanding of how language and culture are negotiated in particular communicative situations. So what does it actually mean in practice? Now, from the overview so far, it turns out that teacher and learner preparation for ELF communication should involve or continue to involve comparative studies of discourse systems and the forms they have available, raising awareness of the problems that lingua-cultural stereotyping may lead to in educational and professional settings, and drawing attention to individual variation and multi-positionality of the interlocutors. And in what follows, I want to focus on intercultural pragmatics and introduce another point to the list above, namely focusing on the similarities in politeness strategies implemented by users from diverse lingua-cultural backgrounds. So, as we all know, pragmatics is concerned with the use of language. It studies the ways in which meaning is communicated and interpreted by particular interlocutors in particular communicative situations. And how meaning is communicated and how utterances are interpreted depends, among other things, on the interlocutor's assumptions about the common ground, which concerns the knowledge and beliefs that interlocutors in a conversation consider as shared for the purposes of communication. And the concept of common ground is fundamental to the understanding of one aspect of intercultural communicative competence, namely sociopragmatic competence, which involves an awareness of how various relations between people and situational contexts influence the linguistic forms we choose to communicate our meanings. So, for example, a conversation between a boss and an employee may be more or less formal depending on how long they've known each other for, their assumptions about each other's personalities, but also institutional codes, etc. But what about talking to people whose background and conversational preferences are hardly known to us? That is, what about situations in which common ground assumptions are scarce? Now, according to Friedrich, such unfamiliar contexts encountered when interacting with people we do not know or do not know much about is common in ELF situations where the linguistic diversity adds another dimension. And consequently, ELT classroom work should help students develop competence in choosing adequate communicative strategies for filling in the gaps in the common ground, and do so with respect. So what strategies, what communicative strategies should be taught? Now, Vetterell lists the following: interactional strategies such as appeals for help, repetition or comprehension checks; compensatory strategies such as circumlocution, word coinage or code switching; time-gaining strategies such as fillers; and self-monitoring strategies such as self-initiated repair. And in the next section, I will argue that the list should be expanded to include politeness strategies. And I elaborate on this proposal by focusing on speech acts. So let me begin this section by describing a situation I encountered some years ago when I was teaching in-company courses at a British company based in Poland. A British representative of the company, who was paying an official visit at the Polish site, commented on my students' English by saying, "Look, Magda, your students' English is really good, and I know they are nice people, but they come across as brusque. They should say please more often." Now, later when I talked to my students about this comment, they were surprised. They were saying things like, whenever I make requests in English, I say, "Could you?" instead of "Can you?" Isn't that polite enough? And Bardovi, Harlig, and May and Taylor mean situations like this when they point out that foreign language learners tend to use and understand certain speech acts differently from native speakers of the target language. And such differences may be interpreted at a personal rather than linguistic level. For example, the learner's use of language may be interpreted as rude or brusque, potentially leading to denials of requests. And considerations like these point to the importance of raising the learner's awareness about the range of available pragmatic devices to simply enable them to have more control of their linguistic contributions. So let us consider whether the anecdote I've just told you actually chimes with the extant research on British English versus Polish request strategies. But before we begin, a caveat is in order here. So in what follows, I won't be criticizing the studies cited as such, but just a potential, rather superficial interpretation of the generic findings in these studies. So the first study I want to mention is Chałupnik's 2011 study, in which it was found that the Polish respondents chose a direct request strategy 34% of the time, compared with 22% in the case of British English speakers. Now, in relation to my anecdote, recall that "could you do X," which counts as an indirect request, without please was judged as not indirect enough by my English visitor. So looking at Chałupnik's findings, maybe the lower acceptance of directness by the English speakers when compared with the Polish speakers could explain the British visitor's perception of my students as brusque. However, we need to remember that my students wanted to and thought that they were being polite enough. So recall in this context their comment on choosing could you instead of can you. And it turns out that this can also be explained by how it makes results. So in this case, the relevant finding is the tendency of Polish speakers to avoid direct strategies for making requests. After all, 66% of the time, direct requests were not chosen by the Polish respondents. And furthermore, note that direct requests were actually chosen 22% of the time by the English participants. Now, this could be taken to explain the fact that my visitor didn't even hedge when recommending that my students should say please more often. So what this shows is that cross-cultural findings will necessarily overgeneralize and over-apply, because what they show is that there may be some nation-based cross-cultural tendencies, but there's also lots of individual and contextual variation. So let us now move on to another problem with interpreting cross-cultural findings, and the example of conditional inducements. Now, conditional inducements are statements which are made to influence hearers' behavior by telling them about the consequences of their behavior. And they can take a form of the conditional promise, as in one, if you work hard, I'll take you to a restaurant, or a conditional threat, as in two, if you don't eat your dinner, I won't give you the pudding. Apologies. Now, the example in one is referred to as the canonical form of a conditional promise, and the example in two is referred to as the canonical form of a conditional threat. Now, notice that speakers also have a choice of formulating the inducement in one as a threat. So instead of saying, if you work hard, I'll take you to a restaurant, they can say, well, if you don't work hard, I won't take you to a restaurant. And we will be referring to this formulation as a complementary form of one. And similarly, speakers also have a choice of formulating the inducement in two as a promise. So instead of saying, if you don't eat your dinner, I won't give you the pudding, they can say, if you eat your dinner, I'll give you the pudding. And we will be referring to that sort of formulation as a complementary form of two. Now, the difference in the formulation of conditional inducements is basically about framing the incentive as a reward or as a punishment. So it's a typical carrot or a stick situation. And it looks like there may be some cross-cultural differences in the willingness to use conditional threats, that is, in the willingness to use the stick. So for the purposes of this talk, I'll consider two questionnaire studies of conditional inducements. The first is Behr et al.'s study into conditional promises and threats in German. And the second is my own and my colleagues' English language replication of the original Behr study. Now, both these studies, both the papers were cognitive in nature, and neither of them was cross-cultural. However, the fact that we have two sets of data from two languages, which were collected with the same instrument, allows us to compare the two sets of findings. Now, in both cases, the participants were university students with the mean age of 22.7 and 20.1 respectively. Now, in the German study, the results revealed no significant difference in the frequency of the canonical formulation of conditional promises and threats. So what this means is that the vast majority of participants chose to promise and threaten canonically, so 94% and 85% respectively. However, there was a statistically significant difference in the English study, where only 62% of the participants, compared with 85% in the German study, chose to threaten canonically. In other words, a significant number of the English participants chose to threaten indirectly by going for the complementary promise formulation. And at this point, one might be tempted to attribute this difference to cross-cultural variation, especially when one learns that in another replication, this time on Tongan, only 41% of the Tongan participants chose the canonical threat formulation. In cross-comparison then, the English participants were more likely to threaten canonically than the Tongan participants, but less likely to do so than the German informants. But can we be sure that this variation is due to cross-cultural differences in the sociolinguistic conventions? Now, me and my colleague have voiced concerns about attempts to interpret these findings in cross-cultural terms. First of all, unlike the participants in the German and English studies, who were university students, the Tongan participants were secondary school students with the mean age of 15.4. Thus, a feasible interpretation of the difference is that the more mature German and English students may have been better at simply doing what the task asked them to do, regardless of their real-life preferences in formulating conditional inducements. So it might be that the people who chose the canonical threat formulation, the stick formulation, in the studies would actually choose to formulate their inducements as promises in real life. And indeed, Belleret's 2009 study, in which the respondents were secondary school students, only 16% of the participants chose the canonical threat formulation. So the choice of the indirect strategy among the secondary school German participants was even higher than among the Tongan students. And what all of this illustrates is simply that we need to be very, very careful about drawing cross-cultural conclusions from empirical studies too hastily, because there may be some confounding variables that we are unaware of. So based on this overview, the implications for ELT practice would be the following. Even though conditional threats are used in English and German and Tongan and other languages, in some situations by some users in unfamiliar contexts, including ELT contexts, it would be advisable to formulate conditional inducements as conditional promises. And this, of course, should be followed by a comparison with the relevant structures used in the students' first languages or language varieties. And similarly, for requests, the recommendation would be to use indirect strategies, and that should be accompanied by an overview of specific strategies and sub-strategies used in the relevant languages. In conclusion, then, I hope to have demonstrated that an inadequate interpretation of cross-cultural data may give rise to fundamental misconceptions about intercultural communication, and that in order to match the reality of ELT communication, what needs to be highlighted in ELT materials and classrooms, apart from the inter as well as intracultural diversity, are the similarities in the use of pragmatic politeness strategies by speakers with different lingua-cultural backgrounds. So thank you for your attention. I'm going to end the presentation now, and I'm ready to take questions if there are any. Okay, so the first question: how, in your opinion, is intercultural pragmatics influenced by the presence of a translator in communication process. Well, I would be surprised if, well, there was no cultural interference, if I may say so, for the simple reason that, especially in, I presume, interpretation context, there isn't probably much time to think about the differences that choosing particular linguistic forms might have in terms of the extra layer of pragmatic meaning. So if you think about the example I mentioned in my anecdote, I mean, could you do that for me? That seems polite enough for a regular Polish speaker, precisely because the form could is used instead of can. However, from the perspective of some English speakers, that would not be internally modified enough in order to sound as polite enough. And I think in well, stressful situations like interpreting in particular, that there must be some level of translator or interpreter interference. So I presume the solution to it is to include as much pragmatics training as possible into the training of translators and interpreters. But I can imagine that there is a wide scope for all sorts of interference. Any other questions? I'm interested in the studies on the relationship of intercultural pragmatics and translation or interpretation into from English. Can you recommend any? Well, not really, for the simple reason that I'm not an expert in translation or interpreting. I know that I know of some papers, but I can't remember the names now, which relate to forensic interpreting that was Spanish to English, because it appears that obviously in courtroom situations there are various situations in which translators, for instance, interpreters, sorry, have to make decisions as to whether, for instance, include in the interpretations aggressive language or swear words, etc., which might potentially influence the jury's perception of the defendant. So there's definitely wealth of research, but I can't give you any particular pieces of literature today. Any other questions? No? Okay, so I think we are nearing 4:30. Do widzenia.